Talk, 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 talk. Art of the Zodiac presents Talk, 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 Talk. I am CV Henriette of Art of the Zodiac, and I'm here today with Aerin Fogel. Am I pronouncing this correctly?
Yeah, nailed it.
Okay, and I've officially can spell your name now. It took me a minute.
Yeah, that confuses people a lot.
So we're here today. I'm in Detroit, and you're in Toronto, which is your home base.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's so many things that I want to ask you. So like, because I feel like you have like 5 lives. So maybe I'll start with I'm going to attempt at making
Yeah.
an introduction for you. You're an astrologer, a
Mm-hmm.
practicing full-time consulting astrologer.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you are a musician. Did I get this right? You just signed a new record contract or a record? I want to make sure it is. Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And you have been organizing a music festival for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so we have astrologer, musician, organizer, consultant. You consulted for The Craft #2, the film, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So there we go. What am I missing from this introduction? What more things do you do?
Part of my client work along with astrology, I also do core pattern readings and tarot, but that's all part of the like client work umbrella, I guess.
Yes, yes. And I always forget the name. There's a specific practice. Is it the core pattern? Is that what this is? The what I'm
Yeah,
looking for? I'm searching for words here.
maybe the core pattern readings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we start there actually? Because that's always fascinating. Every time we have the conversations, I'm like, tell me more about this.
Amazing. Yeah. It's kind of a small modality in terms of like people who practice it. So it's obviously a little less familiar than like I'm an astrologer or a
Yeah,
tarot
yeah.
reader or something like that. So the core pattern readings are essentially channeled readings that look at people's repetitive life patterns that they
Okay.
experience. And it's a way of understanding like where the pattern comes from, how it got started, like what the belief systems are around it, as well as the healing process. And so there's a lot of healing work involved, but the readings are also like a really beautiful way to support people's gifts and like what they're meant to be doing in this life as well.
How does this tie in for people who know nothing? Maybe they know very little about like what astrology is or astrology readings, and they, like me, know very little about core pattern work. How do the two of them overlap in your practice?
Yeah, it's interesting because as modalities, they're totally separate from one
Okay.
another. But the reason that I started doing both
Yeah.
was because they end up being the same thing. Like for clients who I've done both types of readings with,
Mhm.
like we do their core pattern reading and we get this like story or this kind of like main sort of perspective that they view their experience through.
Yeah.
And then we look at their chart and it's the same thing. So the chart is saying the same thing as the core pattern readings. It's just that it's using different language to do that. And so I find that astrology can be a really helpful way to ground some of that sort of big picture information in a more like comprehensive day-to-day way.
Core patterning and astrology, two
Mm-hmm.
modalities that bring you to the same story. Do you think that I know with me, one of the difficulties with astrology is you get a story. You're like, okay, like here we are. We see this sort of habits. We see that maybe this has happened. It's going to come up. It's going to come up again, right? There's that like a little bit of prediction. Do you think the core pattern work helps really dig into the story more? Do you think it provides something beyond the astrology?
Yes, actually, because depending on how you practice astrology, it can
Yeah.
really cement some of our difficulties. And I think there is a fine line between like understanding that, you know, we have choice and we have free will, but also understanding that we have a nature that is going to be with us for a whole life. But I do think that sometimes, like, depending on the perspective from astrology, there can be this sense that, like, well, this is just how it is, and there's nothing that I can do about
Sure.
that. And sometimes that is very true, and that is
Yeah.
the reality. But with the core pattern work, like, part of the beauty of it is to have a sense of these, like, stories or like personalities that we've developed essentially,
Yeah.
and then to be able to say, well, that's actually not who I am, like, truly, like, my true self is not
Yeah.
actually that. This is a series of defense mechanisms that I've built up because of this and this reason. And so to understand, like, a lot of our identity as actually defense mechanisms, again,
Yeah.
it might not mean that we can, like, change everything or, like, undo all of that, but it shifts the perspective to understand, maybe a deeper sense of self underneath that. So I like the core pattern work because it allows, like, a little more malleability or sort of like
Yeah.
flexibility in our sense of self. But then the astrology remains true no matter what, because it's always like a spectrum, like the way that we're expressing our chart.
It almost sounds like the core pattern work reveals our response to the chart, if that makes sense. Like, for instance, if someone has a very difficult Venus Saturn opposition in their chart, and maybe that has marked itself in certain circumstances, perhaps beyond their control, that are very difficult, right? Like maybe some troubles at home, or right, et cetera, things beyond one's control that happen to the person, right? Events. Um, there are a number, this maybe perhaps where free will comes in. There's a number of ways that people can choose, or maybe not choose, how they respond, right, unconsciously. And it feels perhaps the core patterns like, okay, so these things happened, but you don't have to sort of, there are different paths. You can go back and choose how you respond. Or let's
Mhm.
see that perhaps you've responded in this particular way. And so it has brought this sort of baggage. Am I getting at something here?
I think so, because the chart is going to tell us about our response.
Yeah.
And in a way, like, the chart itself is an initial response to being alive, because
Yeah.
it's just like a snapshot of what was happening when we were born.
Yeah.
And I never do a session without thinking about that, because it's so wild. It's like I'm talking to an adult and
Yeah.
we're talking about their adult life that they're having, but we're actually just talking about their birth moment and the way that that is still echoing with them in some way as this impression. So yeah, I think the idea of the chart being a response to something is like a really good way of looking at it, because it's like we're always coming into the world. Like, in each moment, we're like having this kind
Yeah.
of response to being alive that is echoing in some way our birth experience.
Oh, yeah. I like that. I like that. And it seems like beyond just like showing someone this is how you're responding, this is what's happening, the core pattern work allows you to really maybe dig deeper into those stories.
Yes, because then you can say, well, why am I responding this way?
Yeah.
And what is the function of that response? Like, what is it supposed to be doing for me? And
Yeah.
is it actually doing that thing? And maybe is there a different way to respond? So, in some ways, like, the core pattern work is almost like an undoing of the chart, but
Yeah.
that's impossible, because we have the chart our whole lives, and so to some extent, that's going to continue to be our personality. But it's also like an undoing of that, or like a broadening of that, so that we're not as, like, um, limited in, like, the defense structures of that response.
Yes. Because I know you do a lot of ancestral chart work where you
Mhm.
look at whole family trees. Do you bring the core pattern work in there too to tell the story of perhaps multiple people?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I have not specifically done that, although some of my clients who have done family system readings with me have
Yeah.
also had their core pattern reading. And so in that way, we're able to look at, like, okay, well, your core pattern shows up as part of, like, your family lineage in this way. But I think they are very much related. Like, the patterns that we have are deeply interconnected to our intergenerational stories. So they're personal, but they're also collective and familial in the sense that, you know, whatever story I have
Yeah, yeah.
is going to be kind of like a perfect fit for the story that my parents have and that my brother has and, you know, my grandparents. Like it just kind of fits for better or for worse with like the larger family stories that are happening.
What is the, and I hope you don't mind, I'm sort of taking you down this rabbit hole because it's fascinating to me, but what is the history of core pattern work?
Yeah, it's a small body of work that has not been around that long. So there was a school in the States somewhere that started in the early 90s called, oh my God, the name is escaping me.
Mhm.
It'll come to me in like 20
Okay,
minutes.
okay. Yeah, yeah.
It was a very small school of work that was started by a mother and daughter. And because it is channeled work, I think the school itself was somewhat channeled. Like that's my understanding of it.
Okay.
And whoever was there at that time, there was kind of like a small group of students who were learning this work, and
Okay.
they all received initiations to become practitioners and teachers of this work. And then the school itself was only there for about 10 years. So I think anyone who was there at that time received that training, and some of those people are still practitioners, but it is small because it wasn't like this big long lineage or tradition. And so it was kind of like anyone that was there at that time received that training. And then I received my training from one of the women who was there initially. So my teacher was part of that original kind of student group.
Yeah.
She does a lot of trainings, but there are not that many people who do. So it's fairly small.
For people who don't know what channeled work is, or and for those who maybe do, to give some broader context around this, how was it channeled?
So I think there are different modes of channeling. There are
Okay.
some modes of channeling where people will essentially like allow different beings or spirits to like inhabit them or speak through them.
Yeah.
This body of work is a little bit different because it's more like a kind of collaboration.
Okay.
So there are a group of spiritual guides that are connected to this body of work that I communicate with or collaborate with to receive information for people. So it's kind of like opening up a conversation with a very particular kind of person or being, and then getting information through that conversation about this person's deeper experience. So for this body of work, the spiritual guide is called Metatron.
Okay.
So some people might be familiar with Metatron's cube, which is like a sacred geometry image. So that's
Oh.
the representation of the spiritual guides from this work.
Okay. So when you say channeled, it's not only channeled in the sense of that's how the original founders of the school got it, but it is work that you continues to be channeled. So part of what you're doing is having communications with this spiritual guide, Menatron,
Metatron, yeah.
Metatron, with that meta like meta, META.
Like meta, like big picture,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, Metatron. Wow. That's now, which came first? Were you already an astrologer when you brought this in?
They happened around the same time in my life. Although, so I had a core pattern reading when I was 18. Someone
Okay.
gifted me a reading, and that's the bare minimum age. You're not allowed to have one if you're younger than 18,
Okay.
because your sense of self is like still developing. So you don't
Mhm.
want to start like disrupting your sense of self while it's
Yeah.
still arriving. So I had a reading when I was 18. And it honestly changed my life because I was always I still am, but have always been a very like pragmatic person,
Yeah.
and would not say I was really like interested in esoteric work or spiritual work or anything like that. Did not quote unquote believe in anything,
Yeah.
very much an atheist. And then I went for this reading and I was like, what the hell was that? Like, it was just like so profound and so personal and so intimate. And this woman was like telling me information about myself that was like more true than anything that I could even articulate. And so I had to be like, okay, well, maybe my like framework for understanding reality is like not 100. Like
Yeah.
maybe there's like something missing in my understanding of how this world works if that just happened. And so it kind of started me on a journey from there of going back for readings every time I had life questions or every time there was
Yeah.
something going on. I would end up going back for a reading and found that it was the most helpful thing. Like there are all kinds of like ways that we can get help, you know,
Yeah.
like there's therapy, we can talk to other people for advice, there's this or that, you know, there's like medical support and homeopathic support. But going for a reading was like the highest level guidance that I had found. And so after a few years of that, I was like, can I study this?
Yeah.
Like, can
Yeah.
I learn how to do this? Because I was trying to figure out what I was doing with my life. And I realized that this had been the thing that was like guiding my life the whole time, or that I kept coming back to as this
Yeah.
work. So around that similar timing, around this like early 20s time in my life when I was trying to sort of like figure out what I was doing,
Yeah.
I also ended up going for an astrology reading, again with a kind of like skeptical mind frame, like had no interest in astrology, did not really think it was going to be much of anything. And by the end of the reading, I was like, I need to study this.
Wow.
Like, this is incredible. And so that, yeah, that was a sort of simultaneous process. And so by the time I ended up doing my training for the core pattern readings and having studied astrology for like a couple years, I started offering both readings like roughly around the same time in 2012 because, yeah, the timing just kind of worked out that way.
It's, I want, because you've been a practicing, we say the consultant, right? With the core pattern work astrology for like your whole adult career, right?
Mhm.
So, because you did start so young, those first few years before you found this, was it all music or was there another path you thought that you were going to pursue?
Yeah, there was a lot of music before
Yeah.
that. So I was playing in a touring band for a few years and we did a whole bunch of records and you know, things were going pretty well with that. I was also in university at that time
Okay.
studying philosophy and literature. So I honestly don't know like what I thought I was doing. Like I was always going to have 20 jobs. So I
Yeah.
was going to be like a writer and a musician and like you can't really be a professional philosopher, although I kind of think that's what astrology is.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was always just going to have a weird collection of jobs. I think I didn't really have like a clear, this is the one thing that I want to do, but I had many things that I was passionate about. And so I was like, I'm just going to try to like do those things and hope for the best where money is concerned. And I think like at the age of 24, 23, 24, telling my
Yeah.
parents I was going to become a professional astrologer, like I think they nearly had a heart attack because like they were like, and what will your job be? Like I don't think it registered that it was like a viable, stable practice. And I honestly had no idea if it would be either. So I'm fortunate that it has worked out that way.
Have they come around since?
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, they try to be supportive, but they are in their heart like very traditional people who were born to Jews that came out of the war. And
Yeah.
so there's always that part of their mentality that's like your survival needs are important
Yeah.
and your kind of like life foundation is very important. So I understand it was like a shocking thing for them, but they've totally come around on it now.
Wow. This is maybe a question out of the blue, and someone posed it to me yesterday. I was talking to a French filmmaker who's making a documentary on, I don't know, like the occult, this sort of new religious movement in the States. It's
Cool.
not quite, it's sort of all over the place. I mean, maybe in my understanding of it, I should say. And what he say to me? He said, because he was asking, 'cause I didn't know. He asked, is there an overlap between Judaism and astrology? And I feel
Hmm.
like there's so many different threads, so many places you can go with that. I know a lot of famous astrologers were
Mm.
Jewish, but I'm wondering if that's something you've thought about, or if that's something you have an answer for. Not that I expect you to. I know I'm just like throwing this at you.
Yes. And like, as a Jewish person, I feel like I should always know more about this. It's like
Same.
not been my area of expertise, but yes, because I know that in the Kabbalah there's a ton of astrology,
Yeah.
and the whole Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar.
Mhm.
So like in that sense, like it's already in the foundation of Judaism. All of the holidays are structured around the moon cycle as well. So there is like a very basic foundation of astrology in like the whole culture itself. But I know very little about the specifics of astrology in the Kabbalah. And part of that, actually, I would say all of that is because
Yeah.
it's very hard to actually study Kabbalah,
Yeah.
especially as a woman. Like, technically, it is still not allowed to study Kabbalah as a woman, because you have to be a man, like over a certain age, and you have to do like a deep rabbinical study
Yeah.
to get to a point of studying Kabbalah. So you can study or you can like read books about the Kabbalah, but
Yeah.
the Kabbalah is very mystical. Like, that's not actually studying Kabbalah if you've like read a couple books. Like, you might be getting an interesting summary of some of the concepts,
Yeah.
but to study it is a very mystical, somewhat elusive thing that can't really be done just from reading translated books. So, yeah, I wish always that I knew more about the astrology that's built into it. But I think that would be like a whole other deep rabbit hole that maybe at some point in my life I'll try to go down.
Absolutely. I always feel the same. I remember when I first came to study astrology out of like, because I don't have like a, I don't know, like I don't have a tarot background. I'm a very like sort of, I have none of like this sort of spiritual world like completely new to me. And I remember going to people and seeing Hebrew letters, like, you know, other astrologers. I'm like, oh, are you Jewish too? And they're like, no, Kabbalah. And I'm like, oh, I think the whole Madonna thing, or the sort of this Kabbalah Center in New York, which still doesn't make sense to me. But anyways, it's a rabbit hole.
It's a thing. It's a thing.
Like we're gonna
Watered down Kabbalah. That's our
that's
next conversation.
that is a whole conversation unto itself. I always wanted to talk. Do you ever the book of I don't know if he's a rabbi or he's definitely someone studied Gates of Light, that book about that overlaps Jewish thought and tarot.
I don't know this book.
Okay. I it's Gates of Light. I don't want to speak any. It's a saying. I'm going to say wrong things, so I will follow up with that when our follow up conversation. I will have this book prepared and I will send this to you. Um, Circling back. Okay, maybe this is a good way to come into. So actually, I want to think. Okay, so you're in your early 20s. You're studying philosophy at Well, you were prior to, right? So up until 24, right?
Yeah.
When you decided, okay, I'm going to like do this full time. You had been studying philosophy and literature. You'd been touring musician. You sort of came into this world. What did that? Was it hard? Like, what advice? Like, you were like, I'm going to do this. Like, were you like, oh, it just kind of came to me, or what were some of those struggles? And did it change your life profoundly?
Oh my gosh, so many thoughts on this. Um, like, in this weird way, as a queer person and as an astrologer, saying that I was an astrologer was like a harder coming out of the closet than saying I was a queer person. Like, at that time, it
Yeah.
was so weird for people. And to give more context, I was also coming out of the punk scene.
Okay.
And like, I do not think spirituality appeals to most of the people in the scene that I was in, which to me is unfortunate because I find punk to be like deeply spiritual,
Yeah.
and like punk ethos is to me the same thing as a mystical ethos. You know, it is about like looking to the fringes of a dominant mind frame or
Yeah.
dominant culture to be progressive in oneself and to sort of like push at the edges of oneself. So to me, like astrology is so punk and it's
Yeah.
also for the marginalized. Like that's largely how it's used. So it was surprising to me how difficult it was to, like, as I think of it, like literally coming out of the closet as an astrologer. And most people in my life at that point had known me to be like a deeply pessimistic atheist. So I think it was also like a 180 for me, but that's just kind of my life. Like I'm always doing 180s. It's just
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
it. So it was really hard. And I think I got a lot of pushback from a lot of people who thought that astrology was religion and
Yeah.
who thought that I was believing in something that didn't exist. And one thing that I've always felt about astrology is that I don't actually believe in anything.
Yeah.
There's no belief around it to me. I just have seen something work over and over and over again. It's more like something that I know about, not
Yeah.
something that I believe in. And I am certainly not a religious person. I am in most ways like anti-religion.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, like the perception that people were having really didn't resonate with what was actually happening for me or like how I experienced this like whole new part of my life. And then at the same time as that, like there was a lot of difficult stuff that I was healing from at
Mhm.
that time. And I felt like every other system had failed me. Like
Yeah.
the medical system had failed me, like the therapeutic system had failed me. And this was something that was offering like real hope and meaning to me. And so I was like, well, how can you shit on that? You know, like, how can that be bad in any way? So it was a very difficult transition. However, I don't think it's the same thing now for a 24-year-old to say, I'm going to be a professional astrologer, because, like, in those 12 years, astrology has become much more accepted, has
Yeah.
become much more studied. Like, it's opened up as a world. And so I have mixed feelings about it. Like, it's really exciting. And I always want more people to be falling in love with astrology and like using it to create meaning in their lives and to gain self-awareness, but it also has like watered down a lot of the quality of some of the astrology that's being shared as well. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, I think.
Mm. Yeah. Do you, the first thing that I think of when that comes to me is, and I've mentioned this before in previous talks, is I have, and you've been practicing a lot longer than I have, but I get a lot of clients who now come in and they're telling me about it. So it's like, yeah, they're telling me about their astrology chart. They're like, oh, I can read it. I just need some clarification. And yeah, have you noticed a proliferation of that as in throughout the more recent years with perhaps co-star? They're like, let me take my app out, and they just like put a phone in my face.
Yes, yes. And I try to hold that in my heart as like with no judgment as a defense, because
Yeah,
I do get clients who come in and they're like, well, I already know everything, I just maybe have this or that question. And I've been there. Like, I think it's a protective mechanism. And that's okay. Like, I think people come into their session with all kinds of defenses because we're human and that's just like how we are. So I just try to treat that as like another form of defense rather than to get too caught up in like what they do or don't know. And I'm usually just like, okay, well, I'm going to go through like my usual rhythm and you tell me if something that I'm saying is like old news or like, you know, you're super familiar with that and you want to move on.
yeah,
And there's almost never a moment where they're like, oh no, I already know that. Like, it ends up being a really deep conversation anyways, even if it's like, this is an astrologer who has been practicing for 30 years and this and that, they know their
yeah,
chart inside out. anytime you go to a different astrologer, you're going to get a different perspective. And so even the ones who like know the most or have like really deep technical knowledge, myself included, like I love going to other astrologers because I'm
Yeah.
always getting new perspective, like new meaning through that conversation. But it is a newer phenomenon for people to be coming in and like knowing their charts in a different way.
Yeah.
Like the first, I don't know, 7 or 8 years of my practice really were people who had zero knowledge of astrology. And I
Yeah.
love that because I prefer to leave astrology jargon off the table completely when we're
Yeah.
having a conversation about someone's life. So it doesn't actually matter for the reading whether they know anything, but it is nice to like have people coming in and being like, well, I'm also studying astrology, or I also practice astrology. I do readings, like there's just like a different kind of like astrology conversation that can happen out of that reading.
Yes. And I'm going to dig into this for a moment, your early experience. Did you find, and I'm sure maybe you still find this, that when you were 24, beginning your practice,
Mm.
everyone else maybe thought you had done this like 180, like, man, what is she up to? Did you find a lot of like that your clients were actually bringing you sort of a reflection of yourself, and that there was this sort of sense of like healing that came through the clients?
That's such a great question. Yes, 1000%, and also continues to feel true.
Yeah.
Um, Not across the board, but I would say that like large percentages of my clients are often coming to me with transits that I'm also having or with similar placements that I have. Like there's often some kind of like resonance there.
Yeah.
And it's part of like the mystery at work that I don't understand, but I love very much. Or like, something that I went through a few months ago. Now someone is like coming for a session about that very thing. And I'm like, okay, I feel somewhat equipped to have this conversation because I know what that's like. So, yeah, there's always this kind of interesting like connection between my experience and my client's experience. And I love that. I'm like, what is that? Like, how does that work? It's so fascinating. But it's just kind of like a really beautiful form of connection because it's like, a lot of the time I've never met these people before I'm
Yeah.
meeting them for the first time, but there's already this sort of like deep, meaningful connection based on a shared experience.
Yeah. That now I know you don't talk about share your chart publicly. So I'm going to ask you a questions for very, very broad about your chart. And if you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But I'm wondering, right? You've described yourself as a very pragmatic person, right? Is
Mhm.
there like when you learned about your chart, and then as you started to become like as you grew as an astrologer, is there like one perhaps signature that you're like, that's the signature that allows me to really hold space?
Hmm.
Or some like sort of astrological superpower signature in your chart?
Interesting. Like holding space for others, you
Yeah.
mean?
You're like, that's that hidden part of me. There's like the very pragmatic parts, but like this part is what really like I tap into.
Well, I am an Aquarius. Like I have my sun in Aquarius, although I don't necessarily think of Aquarians as like space holders all the
Yeah.
time. Um, but it always makes me interested in people's experience. And I like astrology as a form of perspective, which is essentially
Oh,
like the most exciting thing to an Aquarius placement is like to get the big picture, to get perspective on something. So there is that, but yeah, I would say the pragmatic piece is that I have a lot of Earth in my chart,
yeah.
but my ascendant is much more of like a space holder. So like within me, those two things sometimes feel conflicting, but
Yeah.
people are full of paradoxes. So I think the two of them together probably make a nice balance.
We, when you learned about astrology, right? Was there suddenly like and perhaps this is my favorite part of astrology. Like suddenly you could see yourself. You could be like, oh, there's the pragmatic part, and here's this part. And even though, as you've mentioned, they can be in conflict, like has astrology allowed you to like understand that conflict better and maybe even help others do that as well?
Yes, 1000%. Like, I always think about how there is no value structure in astrology. Actually, I guess that depends
Yeah.
how you practice, because there are
Yeah.
definitely astrologers who will look at something and say, well, this one's good, or this one's bad,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
this is meant this or that. The way that I practice astrology is essentially like non-binary. Like, things are not good or bad, things are not black or white.
Yeah.
And astrology is one of the core foundational tools that helped me come to that in my own worldview,
Yeah.
because I do think in my earlier years, again, as an Aquarian, like I was much more black or white. I was much more like Saturnian about
Mhm.
things. And astrology really helped me like hold space for all of the gray area and all of the complexity of life, which is that things are full of paradox and things are never just one way or another. And so I think about that a lot when I'm working with people, because sometimes I'll be saying something to someone about a placement in their chart, but without calling it bad. And you can just kind of see that it's like reframing it for them. Like, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of a client, without divulging any of
Sure,
like the
sure.
info that we were talking about. I'm thinking about this client the other day who had been really like struggling with something that she felt was like bad, that
Yeah.
was like a desire, like a part of her life, but looking at it as just like part of her chart and it's part of her nature and there's nothing wrong with it. It was like, oh, so it's not bad. Like, it
Yeah.
just kind of like reworks the way that it's like sitting with someone. And I love that so much about astrology. It just helps us accept the way that we are without shame or without trying to like fix anything. Like, everything that's in us is okay, essentially.
Yeah. Th- this is perhaps a loaded question, but how much of astrology do you think is, when I say astrology, I mean like being a consulting astrologer, right? Which is a lot different than sort of academic,
Mhm.
mundane stuff. But how much of astrology do you think is therapy, right? Was there ever a moment in your years of consulting that you're like, should I go back to school? Like, how, like, were
Mhm.
you ever confronted with that?
Every day, yes. I'm still thinking about, going to therapy school at some
Yeah.
point. And yeah, I do think that's specific to the way that I work, because lots of consulting astrologers are maybe just different in their
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah.
But I end up doing a lot of trauma work with
Uh-huh.
people. And then, especially like in the last couple years, having added the family system readings that I do, it's like, well, you're just talking about people's family trauma. Like, it's right there.
Hmm.
Um, and so I often wonder, like, and I'm cautious about the line between that and actual therapy,
Yeah.
because, I am an astrologer. I'm not a trained therapist. And I want my clients to understand that as well. But I also feel comfortable talking about what they want to talk about,
Hmm.
and feel comfortable like holding space for people to discuss trauma and like the healing process around it. So I think it is a fine line, because as astrologers, I feel that it's really important not to spill over into areas of expertise that we don't have. But
Sure.
at the same time, I think it is important, like, if we notice something coming up in our practice, often to cultivate as much skill in that area as we can to hold
Yeah.
space for people. So I haven't been to school as a therapist, but I have done a lot of different trainings and forms of work that I think help hold space for people to talk about trauma. And, it's human, like, trauma is human. And
Yeah.
so I want that to be part of the work as well. But yeah, I think all the time about going to school for therapy. But then, like, I wouldn't be able to look at people's charts if I was their therapist. So it might take all the fun out of it.
Something that I've always the part that always like trips me up too, um, because I have a lot of clients, and I'm sure you do too, who maybe see me instead of, because I can go all day like, maybe you should see, I'm not a therapist, maybe you should see a therapist, and they're like, I'm scared of therapists, like therapists try to put me on drugs, like whatever reasons, I can't find one. And so I'm sure you do too, you probably get those clients that are seeing you, maybe
Mhm.
not a therapist, and so there's that responsibility, but at the same time, that's the catch, right? Like, if you were a therapist, would you even get these clients? I think sometimes people even more like, because there is that sort of fringe component with what we do, that people like, well, I feel safe talking to the astrologer and opening up because our job isn't, we're not doctors. We're not there to heal or fix people. So then there's a level of comfort there that we have that's sort of a privilege.
Absolutely, yes. And there have been a handful of times um, when I set a boundary around a particular kind of work with
Yeah.
clients because I'm like, this is something that I would recommend bringing to a therapist. And I
Yeah.
always have like an arsenal of recommendations that are ready
Yeah.
for people. So yeah, there's that. But I think what you're saying is absolutely true, that there are certain things that people might prefer to bring to an astrologer over a therapist, and there are different reasons for that. Some of
Yeah.
them I think are, again, defense structures, but also I think sometimes people want to be told what to do, or they want information, and you're not going to get that from therapy. Like from good therapy, in my experience, like a therapist will not tell you what to do.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
gonna like be with you as you figure it out. And so sometimes people just need information, and that's what an astrologer is there for, is to be like, well, don't worry because your Saturn transit is ending, but now we have to talk about Uranus,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
you're going to get a different kind of information from that sort of reading. So I think often it is comforting or affirming for people in a way that therapy might not be. But like my favorite distinction is like one client like years ago said something to me that always stuck with me. And she was like, oh yeah, astrology is like poor person witch therapy. She's like, you only have to go once a year and you get all the good witchy information. And therapy, you have to pay to go every week. She's like, I can't afford that. And I was like, yes, that is totally valid.
Speaking of, that's an excellent transition because I wanted to talk to you about this. So, when did you get into magic? Because you were, I still think this is like the coolest fact about you, a consultant for, what was your official title for? And
Occult consultant for the Craft Legacy.
when did this come out? This film? I should know these things.
So,
Yeah.
speaking of astrology, it came out in like October 2020.
Okay.
The film had been filmed in 2019, and the director had asked me to help elect a time for the
Yeah.
film to come out. She asked me in 2019,
Yeah.
and I was just like, if you can wait till 2022 to put this film out, I would recommend it. I didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but like obviously there was like big stuff going on in those 2 years that I
Yeah.
think would be very conducive to like, supporting a film and doing well. But a lot of that is just out of their hands, and the studio was
Sure.
like, we're putting it out now. So yeah, it came out in October of 2020.
Wow. I love that. I love that you have that. You're like, you're like, I tried to warn them. This sort of, I'm taking it was a bit of a box office. I don't know, flop is a harsh word. I don't know
Well,
how it,
yeah, there just was no box office in 2020. Like
yeah.
theaters were still shut down. So it was
Yeah.
just like a straight to Amazon
Yeah.
release at that point. It's also like a smaller film. It wasn't like
Sure.
a huge kind of big budget film. But yeah, it was an interesting thing to work on because I don't work in film. I've never
Yeah.
worked on a film set before. And after that experience, I have deep respect for people who like work full time in film. Like it is such an intense world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your job as a cult consultant on the Craft Legacy? And and before that, what's her name? Is it Francesca? The what's her, she was in the one of the main characters. Who was it? Were any of the character, were any of the actors continue, was it a similar set of characters or cast members?
Oh, it was a different cast.
Okay, okay.
Oh my gosh. As you've already seen in this conversation, like when I have to think of a name or something, it just immediately goes out of my brain. There was, this is also like a spoiler alert, but
Yeah.
there was one character from the original that like shows up in the remake.
Okay.
But other than that, it was a different
Okay.
cast.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm trying to remember what you had a first half to that question too, didn't
Oh,
you?
my, no, is before I just sort of bomb that, my biggest, the main question is, yeah, what were your responsibilities, or what did it look like?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there were three occult consultants on this film. We each
Okay.
had sort of like different areas
Ooh.
of expertise. So my friend Pam Grossman was the consultant around like script development and
Okay.
character development. So she was working with the director, Zoe, like well before I came on board because they
Yeah.
were like developing the film together essentially. And then Brie Luna was like consulting more peripherally, specifically on like some of the things in the film that pertain to like West African tradition and
Okay.
just things that are more in her area of expertise. And then I came on board as the like on-set witch, essentially. So a lot of the work that I was doing, like the script was already developed, so
Yeah.
it wasn't around dialogue or anything like that. But there are a lot of ritual scenes in the
Okay.
film. So I helped with set building, props, like anything that pertained to the actual rituals themselves, and essentially being like, here's how you would build an altar, here's what you would have on that altar.
Ooh.
You know, making sure that if they're like drawing a pentagram, it's done in the proper way, or like if they're walking around the edge of a circle, it's in the right direction, like that, those kinds of details that like, you know, wouldn't occur to someone who doesn't practice.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I helped with a lot of that, but also helped with a lot of more sort of like behind the scenes type stuff, like
Yeah.
essentially holding, trying to hold a more magical or ritual space for the being of the film itself, which was a really interesting practice. And then I ended up doing a lot of one-on-one work with the director, the DOP, and the four main girls in the film
Yeah.
because they were like coming for readings and stuff like that while they were here.
Wow, that's fantastic. Do you
Yeah.
think you'll do anything like that again? Is that like a,
I would if I was asked, but like it's such a specific job.
yeah, yeah,
I don't know how many occult consultants there are in like how much of a need for it there is. Although I think like more and more, like there are more films and shows being made about magical practices. So that's really exciting to see. I would totally do it again. But I would maybe not do like five other jobs at the same time. So this is a thing I'm forever learning. Because I was like,
wow.
oh, 2 days on set is 30 hours a week. So it's not the same as like two regular
Uh-huh,
days of
uh-huh.
work that I'm like adding into the rest of my life. So it was an interesting time.
And I'm assuming yes, but perhaps no. Have you seen the film, and are you happy with the end result as far as the depiction of the depictions of this, the ceremonies, etc.?
Yeah, I'm happy with the way magic was portrayed in the
Yeah.
film. Like it's just so interesting watching something that you've had a tiny hand in
Yeah.
because it is someone else's story and it is like a different story from what I would tell if I was making a film about magic, but that doesn't really matter. It's like everyone would sort of tell a different story if they were doing it. But I'm happy with like the integrity of the magic in the film, and I think it's a really sweet film too. Like I really liked it. It's like, you know, I grew up watching The Craft, so I
Yeah.
have a very special place in my heart for that movie. And I think that the craft legacy was just like a different thing altogether. And so I just kind of like hold it in that way in my mind.
That's lovely. Um, Man, see, I said at the very beginning, you're a person I wish I had 3 hours with, because like there's like so many different streams that I want to take this. But you did an entire episode with Chris Brennan of the Astrology Podcast on your family systems work, but perhaps you could touch on it here for people who have no idea what I'm talking about. Could you tell me like a little bit about that practice and how it came about, how it evolved?
Yes. So I have been doing some work and research around like family systems in astrology for the last, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years or something. It just kind of naturally emerged through my practice, because a
Yeah.
lot of clients would end up bringing me, people who I was working with more long term would end up bringing me charts of their partners and kids and parents and siblings. And so we ended up doing a lot of family work anyways.
Yeah.
And then I started to get interested in like looking at the larger system of it. I also have done a lot of personal work in my own life around the sort of intergenerational link between my personal life experience
Hmm.
and my family's Holocaust experience,
Yeah.
and like understanding, things that are part of, we were talking about patterns in the beginning, like different
Yeah.
patterns that I have or aspects of my experience that I feel are linked to like the intergenerational effects of my grandparents going through the Holocaust. So there's been a sort of parallel study between like my astrological study of it and then
Yeah.
also my personal study of it. And many years ago, I went through like my family's charts, and with my grandparents, I had to do quite a bit of digging, even just to get like their birthdays,
Wow.
because a lot of their documents were like lost in the war, and my parents didn't know the exact birthdays of some of their parents. So I did a little bit of digging and put these charts together and was like, whoa, like really just blown away, not surprised, but still blown away by the parallels of looking at like the family charts as a whole. And then in the last few years, I've done my best to learn more about epigenetics
Yeah.
and to understand the actual biological link between generations that happens. And so epigenetics is not the same as like something that we have transferred through DNA, like,
Yeah.
I have this DNA imprint from my parents. Epigenetics is more about our response to our DNA. So the epigenetic response can change over time. So
Yeah.
when people go through extreme stress or trauma, our response to our DNA changes. And then that can get passed on, even if it's
Mm.
not an actual DNA imprint. So epigenetics is essentially looking at the way that our experience gets passed on as an experience, even if there's no biological genetic link. And vice versa, like when we have healing and when we're in a place of like wholeness and abundance, like that also gets passed on as an imprint. So yeah, a lot of the work that I've been doing is around trying to understand like how epigenetics and intergenerational work can be reflected in astrology, and how we can use astrology as a tool for intergenerational healing.
The first thing that comes to mind is this idea of when I, well, I'll finish this, compassion, right? Like I know even if you're doing a synastry chart, right, with two people, and you're suddenly allowing each of them to see each other in this very sort of objective way, like, oh, your Mercury is in Pisces, your Mercury is in Virgo, right? This is a perhaps when the two of you talk, you can't even hear what you're saying, right? Just as an example, right? But do you find that maybe people who are doing this work suddenly can find like compassion for ancestors or family members that maybe they had been holding some sort of some resentment or anger towards, because they could kind of see their trauma as well? Is that something that comes up?
Yes, so much. And it makes me think about what you were saying earlier around the chart being a response to
Yeah.
something, because we are going to see the response from other people, especially like from our parents and our family members. Like we're seeing the response to their chart.
Yeah.
But seeing where that comes from, or having a deeper understanding of like what's actually going on for them underneath that response, I think can allow a lot of compassion, like self-compassion and also compassion for others, because it's like, oh, they're actually experiencing the same thing that I'm experiencing. That's how they're responding to it. And that's where
Yeah.
the epigenetics comes into play. It's like that response is informed by the response that they got from their parents and that they got from their parents. Like it's just sort of this like hot potato effect
Yeah.
of like different responses that are being passed down. But yeah, I think it can really help from a place of understanding and also acceptance, and just to say like, okay, so I'm part of this system and I have these links here. And I also work with a lot of people who don't have direct contact with their families, and that very well may be like what's needed at that time. But it's like, even if there's no contact, to
Yeah.
have an understanding like, okay, there's some link here, or there's some kind of shared experience.
Do you, when you do this work, is it always one-on-one, or do you ever work with more than one family member at a time?
Occasionally, but I limit it to two
Okay.
because, I mean, first of all, the session is only an hour and a half. And then
Yeah.
if you have like five people in the room, it's like you could
Sure.
talk for 8 hours, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So part of it is practical in that way. Part of it is energetic
Yeah.
because I am a very sensitive person. And if there are too many people in the reading, then it just becomes a different thing. It's like holding a workshop, and it's a whole other kind of level of something.
Sure.
And also because I find it helpful with the family chart readings to like ground the information in one person's chart. So when I'm talking to one person, I'll kind of relate all themes back to themes that are in their chart.
Okay.
And so if we have too many people, it's like there's no anchor. Like it's a little more challenging to like parcel out the information essentially.
Yeah.
But yeah, one or two is good, I think.
Fantastic. And can people, your books are open, are they? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, my books are open. I think right now I'm booking for like early to mid-May.
Okay.
But yeah, always taking clients, always working, and I love talking to people.
Fantastic. And we'll jump to that just in a few minutes. But I want to ask you, we'll have to do a follow-up because, we have like a few minutes left. At some point, I do want to dive in because you have this entire music career in addition to this astrology career, which is just like bonkers to me. I have a hard time doing one thing, and you do several. Do you want to share? I do. I'm gonna give you two questions, and you can like choose or answer them both. I'd like to I'd like to know a little bit more about your astrology community,
Mm-hmm.
because you're on the board, if I'm correct, of Astrology Toronto. Am I getting this right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. A little bit more about that, and then I want to know about this record deal you just signed.
Yes, yes. So Astrology Toronto is wonderful. I joined right around the time that I started studying astrology. So that would have been like 2010 or something like
Yeah.
that. Um, and at that time, I was like far and away the youngest person in the organization, which I loved because I was just surrounded by elders and people who had been studying and or practicing astrology for like decades at that point. So I just soaked up so much information, and it's a
Yeah.
really cool organization. We have monthly workshops from like local speakers. And
Yeah.
then once a year, we bring in kind of like a more prominent speaker for a weekend workshop. So this year we have Jason Hawley coming to
Oh,
Toronto. I'm really excited. Um, we've had, Demetra and Chris Brennan and lots of really, really wonderful speakers. So, yeah, Astrology Toronto is wonderful because it platforms emerging speakers. Like
mhm.
monthly series is designed to give speaking opportunities to astrologers for the first time who are like local or close to Toronto.
Yeah.
And obviously there are like not that many astrologers that like, every single one is new, but like we'll
Yeah.
repeat speakers after a few years. And we try to cover like a really, really broad range of topics. So it's both tropical and sidereal
Yeah.
astrology. There, we've had some Chinese astrology. We've had some like indigenous sky watchers, and it's just a really wonderful way to like connect with other astrologers and kind of have a sense of community around it. So I've really appreciated having it there and also like being on the board the last few years. So yeah, that's the Astrology Toronto community. And then the record deal stuff is a whole other exciting, fun part of my life. So I have a music project called Queen of Swords,
Okay.
and I just announced signing to Get Better Records, which is like an amazing, amazing, amazing queer indie label that's based in LA. And they have a pretty like broad range of artists that they work with.
Okay.
They do a lot of like punk and post-punk and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But lots of like indie and other stuff too. They have like a broad range of tastes. So yeah, they're wonderful.
And I know you're Queen of Swords on Instagram. How do people follow you in all the places?
Yeah, it's Queen of Swords Band on
Okay.
Instagram,
Ooh.
and then on Twitter, it's Queen of Swords with like an underscore after the U. Or if you
Okay.
just search my name, like search Aerin Fogel, it'll come up on both. And then my website is aerinfogel.com. And yeah, I have a link tree on my social medias with a bunch of other like links to stuff that I've done or stuff you can watch or listen to or all that kind of stuff.
Fantastic. And Queen of Swords Band on IG. And do you have a newsletter as well so people can go sign up through your website? Is that the
Yes,
best way
yeah,
so they can
yeah,
keep up
you
with
can
all the
sign up.
things?
Exactly. And
Okay.
I only send newsletters once a month on the
Okay.
new moon. It's called Moon Mail. So
Ooh.
you don't have to worry about
Yeah.
getting emails every 2 days, which sounds like a nightmare to me, but some people enjoy it. So to me, I'm just like, oh, too many emails.
I feel the same. I feel like an onslaught. Now, I'm going to actually ask you a bonus question, and this should be fairly quick, and you could decline if you want. But if someone's interested in learning astrology, obviously get a consultation. But is there a beginning book you recommend to like whet someone's
Mm.
appetite?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question because there's such a range of different options from when I started studying astrology. I
Yeah.
think like the first book I ever bought was called like The Only Astrology Book You'll Ever Need or something like that.
Yeah,
And like,
yeah.
boy, did that turn out to be wrong. Like I have a whole bookshelf full of astrology books now. But I guess like what comes to mind off the top of my head is Chani Nicholas's book.
Yeah.
I feel like she's such a warm, accessible, but incredibly bright astrologer,
Yeah.
and um, is also, I think she does a really wonderful job of like speaking to our generation of
Hmm.
astrology students and astrologers. So
Yeah.
I think her book is like really great for beginners because it's really high quality astrology, but it's written in a really accessible way for like people just dipping their toe in.
And the name of the book, for those who don't know, is You Were Born for This.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. And I recommend that one too. Yeah, it's a great if you're interested just to get the like, what is happening?
Yeah.
What is this thing called a chart? It's fantastic.
Yeah, and then if you want to go like full astrology nerd, I would say
Yeah.
like Chris Brennan's book on Hellenistic astrology or Demetra George's volume 1 and volume 2. Like, those are great ways to like, okay,
Yeah.
if you're ready to like really dive in. But I wouldn't want to read that as the first astrology book I ever read. That would stress me out a lot.
I can still get a little stressed. I mean,
Yeah,
they're great books, but
it's really like intense learning, I think, especially if you're just reading on your own. So yeah.
fantastic. Thank you. This has been wonderful. We know all the places to find you now. So, Queen of Swords Band on Instagram. And Twitter with an underscore, but they could just look your name, Aerin Fogel, Aerin spelled Aerin,
Nailed it.
Fogel, Fogel, for those listening. Find you all the places, book a consultation. And am I missing anything?
I don't think so. I feel like we covered tons of amazing ground and you ask the most wonderful questions, CV. Like you just have like a gift with questions. So it's been so wonderful getting to talk to you.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. I'll say it again. The episodes you did with, you've done a few, but with Chris Brennan on the family systems, your family systems work was just incredible. So the astrology podcast, so people should, I'll put that in the notes as well for those listening, but go back, listen to everything you've done. Thank you. I am CV. I'll give myself an outro. I'm CV Henriette of Art of the Zodiac, and I host these talks. So find me on Instagram. I'm redoing my website at the moment. I'm consulting astrologer as well. But more importantly, sign up for my Substack, which I will be releasing an interview with you through there as well, and Instagram, so we can find out more of these talks. And I think that's a wrap officially.
Amazing. Thank
Lovely.
you, CV.
There are no parents, no other adults, no one to interfere with the fun.